Alright, thrill seekers, we are back. I know your heart is already pounding for this installment of Viral Outlaws. So get ready. Today we'll explore Eddie the Fatman Jackson, leader of the Motown Mafia. Eddie's early life was actually very stable, unlike other outlaws we've explored. He was the son of a successful businessman in Detroit's thriving Black Bottom and Paradise Valley neighborhood. His father made his money selling homemade liquor and used the profits to invest, eventually owning a pool hall and liquor store, along with a slew of rental property. Eddie's father had come from Hot Springs, Arkansas in the 1920s. After murdering a man and changing his identity, he relocated to Detroit.
If I tell you that, then you'll know my business.
Eddie's mother had actually died when he was only 2 years old. In the 1940s, Eddie grew up in a very safe neighborhood with a tight-knit community. The friends that he would make during childhood would ultimately follow him into a life of crime. And under the Fatman's leadership, they would create an empire that is the gold standard of the underworld, even today. The trouble actually started when Eddie's father died. Eddie was 16 at the time. He and his brother were thrust into manhood. They took over the family liquor store and the pool hall. But by the 1960s, you could begin to see the decline of the neighborhood under the thumb of gentrification. And as Detroit fell, Eddie began his rise. The Detroit riots of 1967 thrust the city into turmoil. It was one of the worst riots in U.S. history. It all began when officers raided an after-hours drinking hole that was hosting a celebration for the homecoming of 2 Vietnam veterans. The neighborhood was outraged at the cruel treatment, and a crowd quickly grew. Local law enforcement was overwhelmed, and the National Guard was deployed, along with over 800 state troopers. The raid signified and stapled the fall of the once vibrant Detroit. Also happening during this time was a major influx of soldiers returning home from the Vietnam War. And while at war, they had developed the habit of heroin use, and had to have it. But the drugs that were available on the streets at the time were watered down in comparison to the pure version that they had gotten hooked on while at war. Old Eddie saw an opportunity. He had already tried to work at one of the auto manufacturing companies, but after an injury, he decided to try his hand at the drug game. The Fatman didn't have a background in the street life. He actually had no clue what he was doing, but he had a street dream and was convinced it would work. Eddie was getting scammed left and right by the more experienced guys. They would sell him fake drugs, run off with his money, even rob him. Eddie wasn't seen as a tough guy. He was more of a businessman, but he was determined that this would be a successful venture, so he persisted. Eddie was having a string of bad luck until one day, a customer needing a fix and short on cash made him an offer that the Fatman just couldn't refuse. He promised that he would introduce him to this larger-than-life shadowy figure by the name of John Claxton, if Eddie would just let him slide this one time. So Eddie did it, and was off for his chance meeting. At the age of 25, Eddie had just effectively struck gold, and in a matter of months with this new connection, he was seen riding around town in a brand spanking new 1969 candy red Cadillac. See, Eddie had figured out the game, and Eddie was now a rising star. This is when he decided to recruit his childhood friends and bought an apartment building that would serve as a headquarters. See, Eddie was a bona fide businessman, so he set up 3 shifts a day, paid a salary and overtime as needed. They even had paid vacation. Everyone was happy, and customer service was a top priority. The Fatman even hired Detroit officers and would get tipped off prior to raids. They moved in a way so smooth that they didn't get robbed and they had no enemies. Even though they weren't known for violence, all was well. It was smooth sailing, and money was flowing in abundance. Then, John Claxton disappeared and went into hiding, never to be seen again, once news broke of a federal indictment that was heading his way. That left the Fatman in need of a new connection. When the Fatman needs something, the Fatman gets it. He was able to secure a new plug with the infamous French connection by way of the Italian Mafia. Eddie was known as the crowd pleaser. He would ride down the street throwing wads of cash out the car windows. He would take his team on trips around the world. He was truly living the high life. He was one, if not the most powerful black man in America at the time. If you've been watching the channel, then you know what comes with the life of crime. So in 1971, the Fatman's girlfriend, Farrah Lee, was arrested by DEA agents and found to be in possession of 2 kilos of heroin. One of her bodyguards at the time told agents that she was working for Eddie Jackson. And with this new information, he was now a very interesting person in the eyes of federal law enforcement. The Fatman decided to shut down all retail operations and focus solely on wholesale. Now, he was still making money hand over fist, but without having to focus on the daily operations, he began to focus on family and fun. He might not have been a national celebrity, but he was a celebrity among celebrities. All the entertainers stopped to see the Fatman when in Detroit. While the rest of the city was killing, Eddie was just making a killing and living a good life away from the violence and mayhem. Just months after Farrelly's arrest, Eddie and the crew were raided after being under surveillance by federal agents. Agents found 22 kilos of heroin in the raid, resulting in an indictment of 32 key players in the Jackson organization. Oddly enough, this indictment didn't slow Eddie's money-making progress. In fact, he made even more money after the indictment. 1972 and 73 were the organization's most lucrative years, but Eddie was spiraling out of control, fueled by his cocaine habit. He was pulled over in Missouri, found with $150,000 cash, and again in Pennsylvania with 11 pounds of heroin and 3 kilos of cocaine. Miraculously, both times he was able to wiggle out of trouble, but the heat wasn't going unnoticed. The Jackson organization trial finally took place, and 30 of the 32 were found guilty. And talk about having a good attorney, because none of the convicted went to prison. Not just yet anyway, because their lawyer, Milton Henry, was able to keep them in the free world with his expert knowledge of legal appeals. Eddie Fatman Jackson was ultimately sentenced to 30 years, and his top lieutenant, Courtney Brown, was sentenced to 21. Milton Henry was still at work and was able to get Eddie released in 1984 after a short 7-year sentence. And less than a year later, Courtney Brown would also come home. Eddie wasn't able to keep clean. Less than a year and a half after his release, Eddie was sentenced again. I guess the allure of the game was just too much for him. He would die behind bars in 1995 after battling illness. Thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for riding with me. Comment your thoughts and be sure to subscribe for the next Viral Outlaws.